Chapter 1. The collision of then and now. The grocery cart squeaked faintly as Brennan pushed it down the aisle. One hand draped casually over the handle, while the other held a jar of pasta sauce he was pretending to inspect. His mother stood on the other side, reading labels with intensity that suggested she believed nutritional truth might reveal itself if she stared long enough. "Mom," Kyle said, tilting the jar toward her. "This one says artisanal, which means it costs $3 more and tastes exactly the same." His mother didn't look up. "It means someone cared when they made it," he smirked. "Or someone cared when they priced it." She finally glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "You've become very cynical for someone who still eats cereal for dinner when I'm not around. That's efficiency, not cynicism." She laughed softly, shaking her head before placing a different jar into the cart like she'd resolved a private moral debate. Kyle watched her for a moment longer than necessary. His chest warmed with something equal parts pride and relief. She looked lighter than she used to. Years ago, her expressions had been tighter, her smiles quicker to vanish. Now they lingered. Now they stayed. He liked that. They turned into the next aisle together, their conversation lapsing into comfortable quiet. Kyle didn't mind silence anymore. There had been a time when he filled it with thoughts he didn't understand, questions he didn't want answers to. Now silence wasn't empty. It was earned. He reached for a box of pasta and dropped it into the cart. "We still doing lasagna tonight?" "You volunteered," she reminded him. "I was coerced. You said, and I quote, 'I want to cook something that makes the house smell good.'" Kyle paused mid-step. "Okay. That does sound like something I'd say. You're predictable. I prefer consistent." His mother smiled again, but before she could reply, both of them stepped into the next lane and stopped. Time didn't slow. It snapped. Candice Owens stood 3 feet away, one hand resting on the handle of her own cart, the other holding a carton of eggs she had clearly forgotten about. For a heartbeat, just one. She looked exactly the same. Then the differences rushed in. Her hair was longer now, pulled into a loose braid that fell over her shoulder. Her face had matured in the subtle ways time carves into familiar features. Not change, exactly, but refinement. And her eyes were still the same. Wide, curious, honest. But now they were locked onto him with something he couldn't immediately name. Shock maybe, or recognition crashing too hard into disbelief. Kyle? His name sounded like it had been waiting somewhere deep in her chest for years, and finally found a way out. Every instinct Kyle had built over the last decade kicked in at once. Stay calm. Breathe evenly. Don't react before you think. Those rules had served him well in training, in life, in every moment that might have spiraled into something worse. But none of those instincts had been designed for this, for her. "Hey, Candice." His voice came out steady. Too steady. His mother turned her head sharply between them, recognition hitting her like a distant echo arriving late. Her grip tightened slightly on the cart handle, though she said nothing. Candice blinked, then blinked again, like her eyes needed to recalibrate. You're here. "Visiting," Kyle said simply. "That's..." She let out a breath that sounded halfway to a laugh. "Wow. Wow." There was a stretch of silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the earned kind. This was the kind filled with years. Candice shifted her weight slightly. "You look different." Kyle lifted a shoulder. "I hope so." She laughed then, really laughed, and for a moment it was like high school, like sitting cross-legged on the classroom floor sharing colored pencils and terrible jokes about nothing. Then it faded. "You disappeared," she said. And it wasn't an accusation exactly, but it wasn't neutral either. Kyle's expression didn't change. "Yeah. That's it?" she asked, her brows pulling together. "Just, yeah?" His mother cleared her throat softly, but neither of them looked at her. "You want the long version in the middle of aisle 6? Kyle asked mildly. Candice hesitated. "I mean, preferably not, but also, yes?" A little. That caught him off guard. Just enough for his lips to twitch. "Fair," he admitted. She studied him more carefully now, her initial shock softening into something sharper. Assessing. Trying to line up the boy she knew with the man standing in front of her. "You didn't answer my messages," she said. "Back then." Kyle's gaze flickered just for a second. "I know. I came by your house," she continued, the words picking up momentum now that they'd started. "Your mom." She stopped, glancing briefly at the woman in question, then back to him. "She didn't tell me anything." "That checks out." Candice frowned. "Kyle, how have you been?" He cut in, not harshly, but definitively. The shift was abrupt enough to derail her. Good," she said, blinking again. "I'm good. I stayed in town. Went to college nearby. I teach art now, actually." "Figures." She tilted her head. "What does that mean?" "You always were better than the rest of us." "Not true. You made a papier-mâché volcano look like a structural achievement." "That was 4th grade," she protested, her hands lifting slightly in animated disbelief. Kyle smiled faintly. "Exactly. For a moment it worked. The tension dipped. Not gone, but quieter." "You?" she asked. "Moved. Finished school. traveled a bit, settled into something stable. That's very vague. I'm a vague guy. You're not, she shot back immediately. You were never vague. There it was again, that subtle push. The insistence beneath her words. Kyle met her gaze directly. Something calm and immovable settling behind his eyes. People change. Candice held his look, searching. Yeah, she said quietly. They do. His mother shifted again, this time stepping slightly forward. Candice, she said, her voice measured but not unfriendly. Candice immediately softened. Hi, Mrs. Brennan. It's good to see you. You too. Kyle glanced between them, catching the undercurrent neither of them voiced aloud. The past wasn't gone. It was just waiting. Well, Candice said after a moment, glancing down at her cart as if remembering its existence. I should probably finish shopping before I forget what I came here for. Probably a solid plan, Kyle said. She hesitated, then looked back up at him. Are you in town long? Couple days. Oh, something flickered across her face. Okay. Well, maybe I'll see you again before you leave. Kyle considered that for half a second longer than necessary. Maybe, he said. It wasn't a no. It wasn't a yes. But it was enough to make her smile, small, tentative, but real. Okay, she said again, like she was anchoring herself to the word. Then she turned her cart and walked away, her steps just a little too fast to be casual. Kyle watched her go, his expression unreadable. His mother waited until Candice disappeared around the corner before she spoke. Well, she said softly, that went something. Kyle exhaled slowly, running a hand over the back of his neck. Yeah, he agreed. She studied him carefully. Are you okay? He glanced down the aisle where Candice had vanished, then back at the cart. Ask me again tomorrow, he said, and for the first time since stepping into the store, Kyle Brennan wasn't entirely sure he had control of what came next. Chapter 2. The space where answers should be. Candice Owens stood in the frozen foods aisle for a full 30 seconds without moving, her hand still resting on a bag of peas she had no intention of buying. The cold spilled out of the open case onto her bare arms, but she didn't notice. Her mind was still back in aisle 6. Kyle. Her brain had said the name a dozen times already, but it still refused to settle into something that made sense. Seeing him had been like opening a book she'd half finished years ago, only to find someone had rewritten the middle without telling her. You disappeared. She winced slightly, hearing her own voice echo in memory. Not accusatory, she told herself. Just accurate. Except it hadn't been accurate at all, had it? He hadn't just disappeared. He had left, and he hadn't told her. Candice finally dropped the peas back into the frosty bin and pulled the glass door shut with more force than necessary. The sound snapped her out of the suspended moment just enough to get her moving again. Her cart creaked forward, wheels wobbling faintly as she steered it down the aisle. Okay, she muttered under her breath. You're fine. This is fine. It did not feel fine. She turned a corner and almost collided with a display of discounted cereal, catching herself at the last second. You are absolutely not fine, she amended. Her thoughts spun in tight circles. He looked different. That had been the first thing, though not the most important. Taller, no, not taller, she corrected herself, but he carried himself differently. Like he wasn't trying to take up less space in the world anymore. His shoulders were broader, his posture relaxed but deliberate. There had been a steadiness about him she didn't recognize. And his eyes, that was what unsettled her the most. Kyle had always been easy to read. It was one of the things she loved about him, still loved about him apparently, given how quickly that thought had slipped in without permission. His emotions used to live right on the surface. If he was amused, you knew. If he was bothered, you knew. If he cared, well, that had never been in question either. Now there had been distance. Not coldness, not exactly, but something controlled, something careful, like he was choosing what to let her see. Candice turned into another aisle and grabbed the first item in reach just so she'd stop wandering aimlessly. Turned out to be a jar of pickles. She didn't even like pickles. Great choice, she muttered to herself, tossing it into the cart anyway as if commitment might make it make sense. Her grip tightened around the handle. He hadn't answered her. Not really. Every question she tried to ask had slid off him like rain off glass. He'd deflected, redirected, sidestepped with a calm ease that felt practiced. She stopped again, staring at nothing. People change. His voice, even in memory, had been steady. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just factual. Well, no kidding, she whispered, huffing out a quiet breath. Of course people changed. She had changed. She wasn't the girl who spent entire weekends sitting cross-legged on the floor with him anymore, arguing about whether dragons or phoenixes would win in a hypothetical battle. She had responsibilities now. A classroom full of kids who looked at her like she knew what she was doing. A mortgage. A schedule. But she hadn't changed like that. Not in a way that erased people. Not in a way that made her walk away without a word. Candice turned the cart again, her movements sharper now, purpose threading through the confusion. There were questions, and she wasn't built to leave them unanswered. That much hadn't changed. She moved through the rest of the store on autopilot, grabbing items she actually needed this time as her mind pieced together scattered fragments from years ago. The last time she had seen him, he came back slowly like a photograph developing in stages. The football game, the noise, the lights, the blur of activity. She'd been busy with the squad, moving from sideline routines to halftime setups, catching glimpses of the field more than actually watching the game. She remembered spotting him in the stands at one point, giving her a small wave when she caught his eye. He had looked normal, relaxed even. After the game, she'd been swept up in post-game chatter. The electric high of a win, her boyfriend and his teammates full of loud, celebratory energy. She'd said a quick goodbye to Kyle. Hadn't she? She frowned, trying to grasp the exact memory. Had she? Or had she just assumed she would see him later? Her stomach twisted unexpectedly. No, she remembered now. She had said goodbye. A quick hug. Promised to text him about something. She couldn't even remember what. And then, nothing. He had vanished after that. Just gone. No messages. No calls. No explanation. Candice pushed her cart harder, the wheels rattling in protest as her pace increased. "And you just let that be okay?" she murmured, irritation creeping into her tone, directed at him, at herself, at the entire situation. She hadn't let it be okay. That wasn't fair. She had gone to his house. She had asked. She had stood on that front porch with a growing knot in her chest while his mother looked at her like. Candice stopped walking entirely. Like what? Her memory sharpened. Furious. That was the word. Not sad. Not confused. Furious. Wrapped in a kind of calm that had made it worse somehow. "Did you know?" Candice's fingers tightened around the cart handle as the echo of that question landed fresh in her mind. Did you know what? She had asked that over and over in the years since, sometimes quietly to herself, sometimes louder when she thought no one could hear her. Did she know? Know what? Her breath came out slowly. "If you don't know, it's not my place to tell you." The conversation had ended there, the door closing gently but firmly in her face. No answers, just more questions. Candice resumed walking, slower now, the earlier frustration shifting into something heavier. There had been a boy involved, her boyfriend at the time. A flicker of discomfort moved through her. He hadn't been great in hindsight, too loud, too arrogant, too quick to brush things off as jokes when they weren't funny. But he'd been part of her world back then, and she hadn't questioned it the way she should have. Had Kyle? Had something happened that night? Something she hadn't seen? "Okay," she said under her breath, stopping again near the checkout lanes. "You are not doing this in the middle of a grocery store." This was how spirals started. One question turning into 10, then 100, none of them grounded in anything solid. She needed facts, and there was exactly one person in town who had them. Candice grabbed a chocolate bar from the impulse shelf, justified or not, and placed it on top of her groceries. "You're not leaving this alone," she told herself quietly. Not this time. Her chest tightened, but this time it wasn't just confusion. There was resolve now. He had said maybe she'd see him again. Candice exhaled slowly, tapping her fingers against the cart in a steady rhythm. "Not maybe," she murmured. Her eyes lifted, glancing back toward the aisles as if he might still be there, as if she might turn a corner and find him again standing exactly where she'd left him. But of course he wasn't. That wasn't how this worked. Not anymore. "Okay," she said again, firmer this time. If Kyle Brennan thought he could drop back into her life after all these years with half answers and careful smiles and expect her to just accept it, he didn't remember her as well as he thought he did. Candice Owens didn't let mysteries stay mysteries. And for the first time in years, the biggest one of her life was standing 3 feet away. Not gone. Not unreachable. Just guarded. Her lips curved slightly, a determined spark lighting behind her eyes as she pushed her cart forward. "Let's see how long that lasts," she said softly. Chapter 3, Lines Drawn and Crossed. Kyle spent the rest of the grocery trip on autopilot. He answered when his mom spoke, nodded at the right moments, even cracked a joke or two when the silence between them stretched too long. But his mind wasn't in the store anymore. It lingered in aisle 6, replaying every second of that encounter with a precision that irritated him. He didn't like surprises. He especially didn't like the kind that reached back over a decade and pulled something half-buried back into the open without permission. Candice. He hadn't said her name out loud in years before today, but now it kept resurfacing whether he wanted it to or not. Not as a memory, not as something abstract, as her, standing right there, looking at him like no time had passed and all of it had passed at the same time. "Kyle." His mother's voice cut cleanly through his thoughts. He glanced up as they reached the checkout. "You picked up 3 bags of shredded cheese." He blinked down at the cart. "Did I?" She folded her arms, one eyebrow lifting. "Planning on building a cheese monument? Or is this some kind of coping mechanism I should be concerned about?" Kyle snorted softly, pulling 2 of the bags out and dropping them onto a nearby shelf. "Emotional support dairy. Very healthy. That's what I hear." She didn't smile this time. Not fully. Not until they were back in the car, groceries loaded into the trunk, the engine humming steadily beneath them as they pulled out of the parking lot. The silence stretched for exactly 2 turns before she spoke again. "You handled that well. Kyle leaned his head back against the seat, eyes tracking the passing storefronts through the window. Did I? You didn't run. Low bar. It used to not be. That earned her a glance. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the road ahead, but her grip on the steering wheel was just a little tighter than usual. He let out a slow breath. I wasn't going to run from her. No, she agreed quietly. Not now. Another beat passed. She didn't know, his mother added. Kyle's jaw shifted slightly. You sure about that? I saw her face, she said. That wasn't someone pretending. He looked back out the window, watching the world blur past in familiar shapes and unfamiliar distances. That doesn't prove anything. It proves something. Not enough. His tone wasn't sharp, just flat, measured, but it was enough to shift the air in the car. His mother glanced at him briefly, then back at the road. You've had years to sit with this, Kyle. She hasn't. He didn't answer immediately. That was the problem, wasn't it? Time. It had given him space to build something stable, strong. A version of himself that didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't get caught off guard by the kind of night that used to define him. And in that process, he had closed doors. Not slammed them, not locked them, just closed them. Quietly, carefully. Candice was behind one of those doors. So what? He said finally. I opened everything back up because she looked surprised in a grocery store? No, his mother said calmly. But you don't pretend it doesn't matter either. He huffed a quiet laugh. You always make that sound simple. It's not simple. She turned onto their street, slowing the car as they approached the house. But it's also not something you can ignore forever. I've done a pretty good job so far. Have you? The question lingered as the car rolled to a stop in the driveway. Kyle didn't answer. Across town, Candice was pacing. The grocery bag sat abandoned on her kitchen counter, half unpacked, a carton of eggs dangerously close to tipping over with every pass she took through the narrow space. You should not be this worked up, she muttered, pointing at nothing in particular as if that might hold her accountable. Didn't. She turned again, dragging a hand through her hair before stopping abruptly and grabbing her phone from the counter. Her thumb hovered over the screen, then dropped. Nope, not texting, she said firmly. We are not texting. This is not a texting situation. Because what would she even say? Hey, remember when you vanished from my life with no explanation? Wanna grab coffee? She winced. Yeah, that's a hard no. Candice set the phone back down and exhaled sharply. Think. There had to be a better approach. Something less chaotic. Her eyes drifted toward the window, toward the late afternoon sunlight spilling across the quiet street outside. He was here for a few days. That meant time was limited. That also meant, I need a controlled environment, she said suddenly, snapping her fingers like she just solved something important. Neutral territory. Not a grocery store. Not accidental. Intentional. She grabbed the edge of the counter, leaning forward slightly as the idea took hold. Coffee. Simple. Public. Harder for him to deflect too much without making it obvious. And if he tried? Her lips curved into something decidedly determined. Well, she said under her breath, we'll cross that bridge when he ducks it. The problem, of course, was actually getting him there. Candice pushed herself upright, already reaching for her phone again. Okay, think, she murmured, scrolling through contacts she hadn't touched in years. Most of them were outdated. Numbers she didn't recognize anymore, names tied to versions of people who had moved on, changed, or simply faded out. Then she paused. Her thumb hovered. She tilted her head slightly. Well, she said slowly, that's one way to do it. Kyle was halfway through unloading the groceries when the doorbell rang. He froze for half a second. His mother didn't. I'll get it, she called, already wiping her hands on a dish towel as she moved toward the front door. Kyle stayed where he was, one hand resting on a bag of pasta he hadn't quite pulled out yet. His instincts were quiet, not alarmed, just aware. The door opened. A brief pause. Then, well, his mother said, her voice carrying just enough surprise to confirm what he already suspected. This is unexpected. Kyle closed his eyes for a fraction of a second before exhaling. Hi, Mrs. Brennan. Candice, of course. He turned slowly, stepping into the entryway just as his mother stepped back to let her in. Candice stood there in the doorway, sunlight framing her from behind, one hand still on the door as if she hadn't fully committed to stepping inside yet, until she saw him. Then she did. Hey, she said, a little breathless. Hi. Kyle crossed his arms loosely, leaning one shoulder against the wall with a posture that looked relaxed but wasn't entirely. You work fast, he said. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. You say that like it's a bad thing. I didn't say that. You implied it. I implied curiosity. Same thing, she shot back. His lips twitched despite himself. His mother looked between them, then smiled, slow and knowing, as she stepped further back into the house. I'm going to check on dinner, she said lightly, disappearing into the kitchen without waiting for a response. And just like that, they were alone. Candice shifted her weight, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she met his gaze head-on this time. No grocery store interruptions, she said. No aisle 6. He nodded once. I noticed. I also noticed you didn't actually answer anything I asked you. Kyle tilted his head slightly. You asked a lot of things, and you answered none of them. I redirected. That's called avoiding. Depends on your perspective. Candice took a step closer. Not aggressive. Not hesitant. Intentional. My perspective, she said, her voice steady but quieter now, is that you left without a word, and I've spent years not knowing why. There it was. No deflection. No humor. Just truth. Kyle looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable again, but not distant this time. Not entirely. Measuring. Choosing. Finally, he pushed off the wall, straightening as he let out a slow breath. Okay, he said. One word. Simple. But it shifted something. Candice felt it immediately. Her chest tightened slightly, anticipation threading through the lingering tension. Okay? She repeated. He nodded once. Coffee, he said. Tomorrow morning. Her blink was immediate. Wait, really? You wanted answers, he replied evenly. You're not getting them in my mom's entryway. Candice stared at him for half a second, then let out a short breath that was dangerously close to a laugh. Fair, she admitted. He held her gaze, steady and grounded. 10 a.m., he added. There's a place on Maple Street. I know it, she said quickly. I'll be there. I figured. Another pause. This one different. Lighter. But not easy. Not yet. Candice took a small step back toward the door, her hand brushing against it lightly. Okay, she said again, this time softer. Tomorrow then. Tomorrow. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second longer, like she wanted to say something else. Then she didn't. She opened the door and stepped out into the fading light, the air shifting as it closed behind her. Kyle stood still for a moment after she left, his gaze lingering on the space she'd occupied. Then he exhaled, slow and measured. From the kitchen, his mother's voice carried easily. Coffee? Kyle rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, he said. There was a brief pause. Then, well, she called back, unmistakable amusement in her tone. That'll be interesting. Kyle huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head slightly. Yeah, he said again. This time he couldn't argue with it. Chapter 4. The Things We Don't Say. Candice arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early. Not because she needed to, she told herself, but because punctuality had always been one of her better qualities. It had nothing to do with nerves, anticipation, or the quiet, restless energy that had followed her since she'd left Kyle's house the night before. Absolutely nothing. She pushed open the door, a soft bell chiming overhead, and paused just inside to let her eyes adjust. The place was small but warm, tucked into the corner of Maple Street with big windows and mismatched chairs that leaned more intentional than accidental. Good. Neutral. Casual. Safe. Candice exhaled slowly and stepped up to the counter, ordering a coffee she barely registered before choosing a table near the window. Not too close to the door, not too far away. Strategic but not obvious. She sat, folded her hands, then immediately unfolded them again. This is ridiculous, she muttered softly, glancing at the clock on the wall. 9:53. 7 minutes. She tapped her fingers against the rim of her cup, then stopped when she realized she was doing it. Then started again. Her thoughts drifted, refusing to stay contained. Kyle had agreed. That still felt surreal. Not just agreed, he had set the time, the place. There had been intention behind it. A willingness she hadn't been expecting, especially not after the way he'd sidestepped her questions in the store. And yet, people change. She leaned back slightly, watching the street through the window as the memory of his voice resurfaced. He was right. Of course he was right. But that didn't answer anything that mattered. The bell above the door chimed again. Candice turned instinctively, and there he was. Kyle stepped inside like he'd always belonged there, his presence filling the space without demanding it. He wore a simple dark t-shirt and jeans, his movements easy and unhurried as his gaze scanned the room. When he spotted her, he didn't smile right away, but something in his expression softened. He crossed the distance between them in steady steps, stopping at the edge of the table. Hey, hey, she echoed, her voice steadier than she felt. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, resting his forearms lightly against the table as he glanced at her untouched coffee. Nervous? He asked. She blinked. What? No. He raised an eyebrow. She sighed. Okay, a little. Fair. You're not, she shot back. He considered that for a moment, then shrugged faintly. I've had worse mornings. That's not an answer. It's the one you're getting. Candice huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head as she leaned forward slightly. You're doing it again. Doing what? Dodging. I'm sitting in a chair, Candice. You know what I mean. He watched her for a second, something almost amused flickering behind his eyes before it settled again. Yeah, he said simply. I do. That should have frustrated her more than it did. Instead, it grounded something, because beneath the deflection, beneath the control, he wasn't avoiding her. Not entirely. Candice straightened slightly, drawing in a breath that felt steadier this time. Okay, she said. Let's just start simple. Kyle nodded once. That's usually how these go. She gave him a skeptical look. You've had a lot of these conversations? Not like this. Reassuring. He huffed a soft laugh, leaning back in his chair just slightly. All right, he said. Simple. Candice studied him for half a second longer, then asked the question that had been waiting for years. Why did you leave? The words hung between them. No distractions. No interruptions. Just truth waiting for an answer. Kyle didn't respond right away. He didn't look away either. His gaze stayed on hers, steady and level. But there was a shift in it now. Something deeper. Something more deliberate than anything she had seen yesterday. Measured. Honest, maybe. Finally, he exhaled slowly. Do you remember that football game? He asked. Candice frowned slightly. Of course I remember the game. But that doesn't… After, he clarified. She paused. A flicker of unease moved through her. I remember parts, she said carefully. We won. Everyone was celebrating. I was with the squad and… You said goodbye to me, Kyle said. Her chest tightened. Yeah, I did. You remember anything after that? Candice shook her head slowly. Not really. Why? Kyle leaned back slightly, his posture shifting. Not away from her, but inward, like he was turning toward something that didn't sit easily. I didn't make it to my car right away, he said. Candice's brows knitted together. Okay. I got jumped, he said. The words landed flat. Not dramatic, not emphasized, just stated. Candice blinked. I what? 3 guys. Kyle continued evenly. Parking lot. After the game. Her stomach dropped. Kyle, that's not what? Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't I… You didn't know, he interrupted. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Because that was true. She hadn't known. Not even close. I drove home after, he said. Shouldn't have. I was pretty messed up. Candice's hands tightened around her cup, knuckles paling slightly. How bad? A few broken ribs. Dislocated jaw. Cuts. Bruises. Nothing permanent. Her breath caught sharply. Nothing permanent? I'm fine now. That's not the point, she said, her voice rising despite herself. A few people in the cafe glanced over. She lowered it immediately, leaning forward. That's not even close to the point, she repeated, quieter this time. Kyle didn't argue. He just nodded once. I know. Candice swallowed hard, her thoughts scrambling to catch up. Who? She asked. Kyle held her gaze. He didn't need to say it, but he did anyway. Your boyfriend, he said. The world tilted. Candice stared at him, her mind rejecting the words even as they settled into place. No. Kyle didn't react. He wouldn't, she started, then stopped because the certainty wasn't there. Not the way she wanted it to be. Not the way it should have been. He did, Kyle said calmly. Him and 2 of his friends. Candice's throat tightened painfully. No, she repeated, softer now. No, that doesn't… Why? Kyle's jaw shifted slightly, but his voice stayed even. Does it matter? Yes, it matters, she insisted, leaning forward again. You don't just… Kyle, that doesn't make any sense. He didn't even… He barely knew you. Kyle's expression hardened, just slightly. That didn't stop him. Silence fell heavy between them. Candice's chest rose and fell unevenly as her mind raced through memories she hadn't questioned at the time. Things he'd said. The way he'd brushed Kyle off once or twice when their paths crossed. Little comments that hadn't registered then, but now felt different. Darker. I didn't know, she said finally, her voice cracking under the weight of it. Kyle's gaze didn't soften, but it didn't cut either. I know, he said. The words hit harder than anything else he'd said so far. Candice closed her eyes briefly, inhaling shakily before forcing herself to meet his gaze again. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Kyle leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table before stilling. Because I didn't know if you knew, he said simply. Her breath caught again. And if I did? He held her gaze. Then that would have been a different conversation. Candice felt that like a physical thing. A line drawn. Sharp. Clear. You thought I'd what? She asked, barely above a whisper. That I'd be okay with that? I didn't know, Kyle said again. And that was enough for you to just disappear? His eyes didn't waver. No, he said. That was enough for me to leave before I found out the answer. The honesty of it hit harder than any accusation could have. Candice sat back slowly, her chest tight, her thoughts tangled in places she hadn't been forced to examine before. You should have told me, she said. But it sounded weaker now, less certain. Maybe, Kyle said. You don't think so? I think, he said carefully. I made the best decision I could with what I had. Candice looked down at her hands, at the faint tremor she hadn't noticed before. Years, all those years, built on something she hadn't known, a truth that had existed without her. You left me without answers, she murmured. Kyle didn't flinch. You left me without trust, he replied. The words weren't harsh. but they landed heavy. Candice looked up, something fragile flickering in her expression. I didn't break that, she said. Kyle studied her quietly. No, he said after a moment. You didn't. Another pause. This one quieter. Not empty, just complicated. Candice let out a slow breath, her shoulders dropping slightly as the weight of everything settled. So what now? She asked softly. Kyle looked at her. Really looked this time, not through layers of distance or control, but directly. I don't know, he admitted. It wasn't a deflection. It wasn't avoidance. It was the first completely unguarded answer he'd given her. And somehow that was the one that mattered most. Chapter 5. Fault lines and funny bones. Kyle didn't expect the conversation to feel lighter after that. But it did. Not immediately. Not all at once. There was still weight sitting between them, years of it layered unevenly, but something had shifted. The truth, ugly and inconvenient as it was, had cracked the surface. And once it was there, it refused to sit quietly in the dark. Candice exhaled slowly, dragging a hand back through her hair before letting it fall to the table again. This is a lot, she admitted, her voice quieter now. Kyle nodded once. Yeah. You just carried that? By yourself. He shrugged faintly. At first. Then it was just part of the story. She frowned at him. That's not how stories are supposed to work. Depends on who's telling them. That's not funny. He tilted his head slightly. It wasn't a joke. Candice stared at him for a second longer, then huffed out a breath that held more frustration with herself than him. I can't decide if I'm mad at you or mad at 18-year-old me, she muttered. Probably both, Kyle said. Her eyes flicked up. You don't get to vote on that. I just did. She narrowed her gaze at him, but there wasn't real heat behind it anymore. Not the kind from before. This was something else, something sharper but less brittle. You really thought I'd be okay with that? She asked again, quieter this time. Kyle leaned back slightly, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. He didn't rush the answer. I thought there was a chance, he said honestly. Not a big one, but enough. That's insane. Yeah, he agreed. It is. Candice blinked, thrown slightly by the easy admission. You're just agreeing with me? I don't have a better argument. She stared at him, searching his face like she expected to find something hidden there. Something that would make it all make more sense. What did I miss? She asked. Kyle's brow furrowed slightly. What do you mean? She leaned forward again, this time slower, more deliberate. All those years, she said. We were best friends. I knew when you were stressed about a test. I knew when you were lying about liking someone's art project so you wouldn't hurt their feelings. I knew. She stopped, her voice catching slightly before she forced it steady again. I knew you. Kyle didn't interrupt, but he didn't look away either. And somehow, she continued, I didn't know that something was wrong. Not with him. Not with any of it. So what did I miss? There was no accusation in her tone this time. Just something raw. Kyle exhaled slowly, leaning forward to mirror her posture. You didn't miss anything, he said. That's not true. It is, he replied. You weren't looking for it. Candice shook her head. That's the same thing. No, he said, his voice firmer now. It's not. She paused. You trusted someone, he continued. That's not a failure, Candice. That's what you're supposed to do. Not when they're... She stopped again, clenching her jaw briefly. Not when they're like that. Kyle's gaze softened slightly. Not visibly at first, but enough that the edge eased off his words. You didn't know they were like that, he said. That's the difference. Candice sat back slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. I feel like I should have, she murmured. Why? Because I was with him. And that should count for something. Kyle considered that for a moment, then asked, did he ever act like that around you? Candice hesitated. No, she admitted. Then what exactly were you supposed to catch? She opened her mouth, then stopped, because there wasn't an answer. Not a real one. Kyle leaned back again, picking up his coffee and taking a small sip before setting it down. People don't advertise the worst parts of themselves, he said. Not unless they're really bad at it. I would have left him, she said quickly, the words rushing out like they'd been sitting there waiting. If I knew, if I had any idea, I would have ended it immediately. Kyle nodded once. I believe you. That stopped her. You do. Yeah. No hesitation? None. Candice blinked again, her chest tightening unexpectedly. Then why? She trailed off, then tried again. Why didn't you give me the chance to prove that? Kyle's fingers tapped once against the table before stilling again. Because I didn't want to be wrong, he said. The simplicity of it hit harder than anything complicated could have. Candice let out a slow breath. That's frustratingly honest. I've been told. She studied him for a moment longer, then leaned back in her chair, her lips pressing together as she processed everything. The tension was still there, but something else had started to creep in around the edges. Familiarity. Not the old kind, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that remembered how to exist in the same space without everything turning into a battle. Well, she said finally, rubbing her temples lightly. This is definitely not how I imagined this conversation going. Kyle's mouth twitched faintly. What was your plan? I don't know. Dramatic confrontation? She said. Accusations. Maybe a speech. I'm a little disappointed I didn't get a speech. Oh, don't worry, she shot back, a hint of her old spark returning. It's still in there. I figured. A small smile slipped through before she could stop it. And just like that, the air shifted again. Lighter. Not easy but not suffocating either. Candice glanced down at her coffee, then back up at him. So, she said, tilting her head slightly, you got jumped, moved across the country, learned how to look like you could win a fight with a refrigerator. That's a very specific comparison. I stand by it, she replied. What else did I miss? Kyle huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head slightly. I didn't plan the refrigerator thing. You just evolved into it? Something like that. Candice leaned forward, resting her chin lightly against her hand as she studied him again. This time less like she was searching for cracks, and more like she was trying to understand the shape of something new. You're not the same, she said. Kyle met her gaze. No, but you're not. Completely different either. Also no. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she hadn't fully put into words yet. That's weirdly reassuring. It should be. Why? Because it means the parts you liked weren't fake. Candice held his gaze, something softer settling in her expression now. I didn't think they were. Good. Another pause. Not uncomfortable this time. Just full. Candice tapped her fingers lightly against the table again. But this time the motion was thoughtful rather than restless. So what happens now? She asked, echoing the question from the day before, but meaning something slightly different now. Kyle leaned back in his chair, considering. That depends, he said. On what? He met her eyes directly, something almost teasing flickering there for the first time since this conversation started. On whether you're planning that speech. Candice blinked. Then, a laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Real. Unfiltered. A little surprised. Wow, she said, shaking her head. There he is. Kyle raised an eyebrow. Who? The guy who used to make terrible jokes when things got too serious. They weren't terrible. They were objectively terrible. You laughed. I felt bad for you. Sure you did. Candice smiled again, this time easier. And something in her chest loosened. Not fixed. Not resolved. But possible. Okay, she said, sitting up a little straighter. No speech. Kyle nodded once. Good. But, she added quickly, pointing a finger at him, I do have follow-up questions. I had a feeling. And I'm not letting you dodge them. He tilted his head, considering her with that same steady calm. But now there was something warmer beneath it. All right, he said. Candice blinked. That's it? No argument. Not today. She narrowed her eyes slightly. You're planning something. Probably. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head again. And just like that, for the first time since she saw him in that grocery store, it didn't feel like they were standing on opposite sides of something. It felt like they were figuring out how to stand in the same place again. Carefully, awkwardly, but together. Chapter 6. A detour nobody planned. They left the cafe an hour later. Not because they ran out of things to say, but because the conversation had reached that quiet, natural pause where continuing would feel forced. Neither of them rushed to fill it. That more than anything felt new. Candice stepped out into the late morning sunlight, blinking slightly as brightness replaced the warmth of the cafe. Kyle followed, holding the door just long enough to catch it before it closed behind her with a soft click. So, she said, turning to face him as she adjusted her bag on her shoulder. That was unexpectedly productive. Kyle slid his hands into his pockets, glancing up and down the street like he was orienting himself again. That's one way to describe it. She narrowed her eyes slightly. You have a better one? He tilted his head. Less chaotic than expected? Her lips twitched. Okay, that's fair. A small pause settled between them, but it wasn't awkward. Just open. Candice exhaled slowly, then made a decision before she could overthink it. I have about an hour before I need to be somewhere, she said. You're clearly not doing anything important, so. Kyle glanced at her. Clearly, you're walking around without a schedule, she said. That's suspicious. I'm on vacation. Exactly, she said, nodding once as if that proved her entire point. Which means I'm about to hijack it. He studied her for a moment, that same thoughtful look settling in. And do I get a say in this hijacking? He asked. Technically, she allowed, then shrugged. But I wouldn't recommend using it. That earned her the faintest hint of a smile. Dangerous confidence, he muttered. I teach children, she replied. It's a survival trait. Kyle huffed a quiet laugh, then nodded once. All right, he said. What's the plan? Candice's expression brightened immediately, like she'd been waiting for that exact answer. There's a park a few blocks down, she said, already turning and starting toward it. It's got this walking trail and, don't laugh, a terrible duck pond. Kyle fell into step beside her. What makes a duck pond terrible? Oh, you'll see, she said. It's aggressively mediocre. That sounds intentional. It's consistently disappointing, she corrected. Which is somehow worse. Kyle glanced at her as they walked, watching the way her energy shifted when she spoke. Lighter, more animated than it had been in the cafe. You've thought about this a lot, he observed. I have strong opinions about ducks, she said seriously. I'm learning that. Candice bumped his arm lightly with hers as they turned the corner. Don't act like this isn't fascinating, she said. It's definitely something. Rude. They walked in comfortable silence for a few steps after that, the quiet now easier than it had been earlier. Not empty, just settled. Candice glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. You really just showed up yesterday and expected nothing to happen, didn't you? Kyle raised an eyebrow. I didn't expect a grocery store ambush, if that's what you mean. No, I mean this. She gestured vaguely between them. You didn't plan on seeing me. He didn't answer right away. No, he said finally. And if we hadn't run into each other? Then I would have left in a few days. Gone home. Life continues. Candice absorbed that quietly, her steps slowing just slightly before she corrected her pace. And you'd have been okay with that? Kyle glanced at her. Would you have? She opened her mouth, then paused. No, she admitted after a moment. Then there's your answer. Candice huffed softly. That's not fair. You don't get to answer my questions with more questions. It's working so far. She shot him a look, but it faded quickly into something more thoughtful. I would have wondered, she said. If I'd heard you were in town and didn't see you. Kyle nodded once. Yeah. And I probably would have gone to your mom's house anyway, she added. That tracks. I'm not subtle, she said. I noticed. She smiled faintly, then looked ahead as the park came into view. Tall trees cast shifting shadows across the path, the late morning sun filtering through leaves in scattered patterns that danced with the breeze. A few people walked the trail, some with dogs, some alone, but it wasn't crowded. See, Candice said, gesturing ahead. Perfect. Kyle glanced around, taking in the space. Not bad. Wait until you see the ducks. I'm bracing myself. They walked side by side along the path, their footsteps falling into a natural rhythm without effort. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, but it didn't press. It gave them room to think. Candice broke it first. What's your life like now? She asked, glancing at him. Kyle considered the question. Structured, he said. Mostly predictable. I like knowing what comes next. That doesn't sound like you. It is now. She tilted her head, studying him again. Because of what happened. Partly, he admitted. Partly because I realized I didn't like being caught off guard. Candice nodded slowly. Makes sense. And you? He asked. How's the art teacher life? She smiled, softer this time. Messy. In a good way? Usually, she said. Kids don't care about pretending. If they don't like something, you know immediately. Sounds efficient. It is, she said. Also loud. And chaotic. And occasionally involves glue in places it should never be. Kyle snorted. I remember you getting glue stuck in your hair once. That was one time, she protested. It was not one time. Okay. It was more than one time, she admitted. Thought so. They reached the pond then. Candice stopped, gesturing dramatically. Behold, she said. The most underwhelming duck pond in existence. Kyle stepped up beside her, looking out over the water. There were, in fact, ducks. A few. Floating lazily in water that wasn't particularly clear, surrounded by a shoreline that looked perpetually halfway maintained. Kyle blinked once. That's it. I told you, she said. Aggressively mediocre. He nodded slowly. It's somehow worse than I expected. Thank you. They stood there for a moment, side by side, watching a duck flap its wings for no apparent reason. Kyle glanced at her. You brought me here for this? Candice crossed her arms, feigning offense. I brought you here for the experience. I feel enriched. You should. A laugh slipped out again, easy this time without hesitation. Candice felt it settle in her chest differently than before. Not forced, not fragile, just there. She glanced at him again, more thoughtful now. You seem okay, she said. Kyle raised an eyebrow. I should hope so. No, I mean, she hesitated, searching for the right words. You didn't let it break you. Kyle looked back at the pond, his expression quieter. I didn't want it to, he said. Candice nodded slowly. That's impressive. It's practical, he corrected. Still counts. Another pause, softer this time. Candice shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing his again, but she didn't pull away. Okay, she said, glancing up at him. Next question. Kyle sighed lightly. Of course, she smiled. You said you travel, she said. Where's the weirdest place you've been? Kyle blinked, clearly caught off guard by the shift. That's your next question? Forward momentum, she replied. We're not circling back into heavy stuff every 5 minutes. He studied her for a moment, then nodded faintly. Fair enough. And? she prompted. Kyle looked back out at the pond, thinking. There was this one town in Arizona, he began. Candice leaned in slightly, listening. And just like that, the conversation moved forward. Not away from the past, but beyond it. Chapter 7. The weight of laughter. Kyle didn't expect to enjoy himself. That was the part that caught him off guard. Not the walk, not the conversation, not even the slow unraveling of something he'd carefully boxed away years ago. Those things he could understand, file away, analyze if he needed to. But this? Standing beside Candice while she tried to explain, with unwavering seriousness, why one particular duck looked like it had strong opinions about taxes. That wasn't supposed to happen. I'm telling you, she insisted, pointing toward a squat, unimpressed-looking duck drifting closer to shore. That one judges people. Kyle folded his arms, studying the duck like it might confirm her theory. It's a duck. That's what it wants you to think. He glanced at her. You've thought about this too much. You haven't thought about it enough, she shot back. A laugh slipped out before he could stop it, low, easy, and unforced. Candice froze mid-gesture, her finger still pointed at the alleged judgmental duck. There it is, she said, narrowing her eyes. What? That laugh, she replied, dropping her hand. That's new. Kyle nodded toward the pond. I think the duck earned it. Deflection, she said immediately. Classic. Observation, he corrected. Candice crossed her arms, studying him again with that now familiar intensity. Not intrusive, not uncomfortable, just persistent. You weren't like this yesterday, she said. Kyle tilted his head slightly. Like what? Relaxed, she said simply. He didn't answer right away, because she wasn't wrong. Yesterday had been controlled, careful in a way that bordered on rigid. Every word considered, every reaction measured. Today had cracks in that control. Not failures, just openings. Yesterday was different, he said finally. Candice watched him closely. Because of me? Because of what you represent, he clarified. She raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. It's not, he said. Just honest. Candice shifted her weight, stepping closer to the railing at the edge of the pond. Her fingers brushed lightly against the metal as she looked out over the water again. Okay, she said after a moment. Explain that. Kyle moved beside her again, his arms still loosely folded as he leaned back against the railing. You're not just you, he said. That's incredibly confusing. You're a reminder, he clarified, of a version of my life I walked away from. Candice didn't react immediately. She just processed. And that makes me what? Complicated? She asked. Kyle glanced at her. A little. She nodded once. Fair. A breeze stirred the water, rippling the surface just enough to shift the reflection of the sky. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Candice sighed softly. I don't like that, she admitted. Which part? The idea that I'm tied to something bad for you, she said. I don't want to be the person who reminds you of that night. Kyle studied her quietly. You're not, he said. She turned her head slightly, searching his face. Not really. Not really, he confirmed. Then what am I reminding you of? Kyle hesitated. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way thinking about it didn't. Before, he said. Candice's expression softened. Just a fraction. Before, she repeated. Yeah. She let that settle, something thoughtful taking shape behind her eyes. Well, she said after a moment, a small smile forming. I guess that depends on which parts you remember. Kyle huffed quietly. Some of them are questionable. Oh, absolutely, she agreed. You had terrible taste in music. That is not true. You thought you were edgy for listening to acoustic covers of sad songs. I was edgy. You were deeply unthreatening, she corrected. Kyle smirked faintly. That's just because you weren't paying attention. Candice blinked, caught slightly off guard by the tone. Excuse me? Nothing, he said lightly. Oh no, she shot back, stepping closer. You don't get to say something like that and then bail. Kyle pushed off the railing, taking a half step back. I noticed things, he said. That's all. Her eyes narrowed, interest sharpening. Like what? Kyle smiled faintly, but there was something guarded in it now. Like how you're suddenly very interested in details you didn't care about before. Candice opened her mouth, then paused. Okay, that's annoyingly accurate, she admitted. I have my moments. She looked at him, really looked this time, like she was piecing together something she hadn't fully understood before. You weren't as out of it as I thought you were, she said slowly. Kyle raised an eyebrow. Out of it. You know what I mean, she said. Back then you always seemed like you were just going with the flow, letting things happen around you. And now you seem like you see everything, she said. Kyle didn't respond right away, because that wasn't entirely wrong either. I learned to pay attention, he said finally. Candice nodded slowly. That makes sense. Another pause settled between them, but this one was quieter, heavier, not in a bad way, just thoughtful. Candice shifted again, leaning her weight against the railing this time. Can I ask you something? She said. Kyle glanced at her. You've been asking all morning. Yeah. But this one's different. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. She hesitated just a second, then pushed through it. Did you ever? She stopped, rewording as she went. Did you ever miss me? Kyle didn't look away. That was the first thing she noticed. No deflection. No dodge. Just stillness. Yes, he said. The answer was immediate. Candice blinked, caught off guard by how quickly it came. Really? Yeah. Her breath hitched slightly. Even after everything? Kyle's gaze didn't waver. Especially after everything. That landed differently. Deeper. Candice looked down at her hands, suddenly unsure where to put them. What to do with the weight of that answer. I thought you forgot about me, she admitted quietly. Kyle shook his head once. Not possible. She let out a shaky breath that almost turned into a laugh. Well, she said. That's good to know 10 years later. Timing's not my strength. That's becoming very clear. A small smile tugged at his mouth again. Candice looked back up at him, something softer settling into her expression. Less guarded, less defensive, more open. I missed you too, she said. Kyle exhaled slowly, like he hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Yeah? He asked. Yeah, she confirmed. A lot, actually. There was a beat, then another. And for the first time since all of this started, there was nothing in the space between them that needed fixing. No tension that needed easing. No question that needed answering. Just truth. Candice smiled faintly. Well, she said, nudging his arm lightly again. Look at us, being emotionally functional adults. Kyle snorted. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Speak for yourself, she replied. I'm thriving. You ambushed me in a grocery store. And I stand by that decision. He laughed again. And this time it didn't feel like something breaking through. Felt like something returning. Chapter 8. The edge of something new. The afternoon stretched lazily around them. Sunlight shifting overhead as time moved. Quietly, steadily, without asking permission. Kyle noticed it in small ways. The shadows lengthening along the path. The subtle change in the breeze. The way the park began to fill with more people. As if the day itself was gathering momentum. And still, neither of them rushed to leave. Candice had shifted to sitting on the low stone edge near the pond. Her legs stretched out in front of her. One ankle crossed over the other. Kyle stood nearby at first, but eventually leaned back against a tree, arms crossed loosely, posture relaxed in a way that would have felt foreign to him just yesterday. You know, Candice said, squinting slightly at the water. If you had told me 2 days ago that I'd be sitting here with you after 10 years, I would have assumed I finally lost my mind. Kyle tilted his head. That's your first assumption? Always go with the most likely scenario, she replied. Harsh. Accurate. He smiled faintly, glancing out toward the ducks again. I didn't expect this either, he admitted. Candice looked up at him, curiosity flickering. Yeah, but in a good way or a bad way? Kyle considered the question. That was something he'd learned, actually consider, instead of filling the silence with something halfway true just to move on. In a complicated way, he said finally. She hummed softly. That sounds like a Kyle answer. It's an honest one. I didn't say it wasn't. Candice shifted slightly, turning to face him more directly now. But if you had to choose, she pressed. Good complicated or bad complicated? Kyle didn't hesitate this time. Good. Her lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. Okay, she said. I'll take that. A comfortable quiet settled again. Candice leaned back on her hands, tilting her face up toward the sky for a moment before speaking again. You know what's strange? She said. Kyle glanced over. That you're speaking in hypotheticals again? Rude, she muttered, then continued. But no, what's strange is, I thought seeing you again would be harder. He raised an eyebrow. This has been easy for you? She snorted. No, obviously not. But I mean, I thought it would feel more broken. Kyle watched her carefully, something thoughtful threading through his expression. And it doesn't? He asked. Candice shook her head slowly. No, she said. It feels different, sure, but not broken. She met his gaze then, her voice quieter, like we skipped a chapter instead of ending the whole story. Kyle let that settle. He didn't dismiss it, but he didn't accept it blindly either. That's one way to look at it, he said. You don't agree? He shifted slightly, pushing off the tree and stepping closer before leaning one shoulder against it again. I think we ended something, he said carefully. And now we're starting something else. Candice tilted her head, studying him. That sounds a very final. It's not, he said. Just accurate. She pressed her lips together, considering that. Okay, she said slowly. I can work with accurate. A hint of a smile tugged at Kyle's mouth again. Thought you might. Candice glanced down at the ground, tracing an absent pattern with the toe of her shoe. You know what else is weird? She said. Kyle exhaled softly. I'm sensing a theme. She ignored that. I'm not as mad as I thought I'd be, she admitted. That pulled his attention more fully back to her. No. She shook her head, a small frown forming. I mean, I should be, right? She said. You disappeared. You made decisions for both of us. You didn't trust me enough to let me decide how I felt about it. Kyle didn't interrupt. But, I get it, she added quietly. That was the part he hadn't expected. He studied her face, looking for hesitation, for uncertainty. But what he found was something steadier. I don't like it, she continued. But I understand it. Kyle nodded once. That's more than fair. Candice looked up at him again, something more grounded in her expression now. I don't want to spend the next however many years being mad about something neither of us can change, she said. Good policy. Don't reduce it to a policy, she said, narrowing her eyes. This is me being emotionally mature. I'm impressed. You should be. Another small laugh slipped between them. Easier now. Familiar, even. Candice pushed herself up from the stone edge, brushing off her hands as she stepped back toward the path where Kyle stood. Okay, she said, adjusting her bag again. Reality check. All right. I have to go to work in. She checked her phone, then winced. 25 minutes. Kyle nodded. That's probably important. They tend to frown on teachers not showing up. Students too, I imagine. Only the good ones, she replied. He smirked faintly. Candice hesitated then, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag. Here it was, the part no one planned. What happens now? She asked. It wasn't the same question as before. This one had weight behind it. Intent. Kyle saw it immediately. He straightened slightly, his posture shifting. Not defensive, not guarded, but more deliberate. I'm here for a few days, he said. I know. I don't disappear anymore. Candice held his gaze, searching for something in it. She found it. Consistency. Not promises. Not guarantees. But something solid enough to stand on. Good, she said softly. Another moment passed. Then, my number hasn't changed, she added. Her voice just a little lighter now. Which is actually impressive, considering how bad I am with phones. Kyle raised an eyebrow. You're assuming I don't already have it. Her eyes widened slightly. Do you? He let the pause hang for just a second too long. Then, no, Candice huffed, rolling her eyes. That's unnecessarily dramatic. It keeps things interesting. She shook her head, pulling her phone out and stepping closer to him. Give me yours, she said. Kyle complied, handing it over without hesitation. Candice entered her number quickly, then handed the phone back. There, she said. Now you have no excuse. Did I need one? She smirked. You seem like the type. Only when necessary. Candice studied him for a moment longer, then nodded to herself like she'd come to some internal agreement. Okay, she said. This works. Yeah. She took a step back, then another, creating just enough distance to feel the moment shift toward something like goodbye. But not quite. Don't disappear again, she said. It wasn't a demand. Not exactly. More like a boundary, wrapped in something lighter. Kyle met her gaze, steady. I said I wouldn't. And you're different now, she added. I am. She nodded slowly. Okay, she said again. Then softer. See you soon. Kyle didn't hesitate. Yeah, he said. And this time it felt like a promise. Epilogue. What he chose 2 years later. Kyle Brennan stood in the same park, staring at the same aggressively mediocre duck pond. Nothing about it had improved. The water still looked like it couldn't quite decide what color it wanted to be. The ducks still carried themselves with the same quiet indifference to anything resembling urgency. And somewhere out there, that one still looks like it files complaints with the city, Candice said, pointing with absolute certainty. Kyle didn't even turn his head this time. Yeah, he replied. It's probably on a first-name basis with the mayor. Candice shot him a sideways look, lips quirking. You're learning. Exposure therapy, he said. She bumped her shoulder lightly into his. Admit it, she said. You missed this. Kyle's gaze lingered on the water for a moment, and longer before shifting, not to the ducks, not to the trees, but to her. I missed you, he said. Candice stilled just slightly. Even now, even after everything, after 2 years of rebuilding something from the ground up in ways neither of them had expected, the directness still caught her sometimes. She recovered quickly, though. She always did. Good answer, she said, though her voice had softened. Kyle huffed a quiet laugh and leaned back against the same railing they'd stood by that first afternoon. It had become a habit, returning here. Not every week, not even every month, but often enough that the place had shifted from coincidence to intention. Like most things in his life now. Intentional. That was the difference. 2 years ago, Kyle had thought about leaving again. Not immediately, not in some dramatic, instinctive way, but in the quieter sense. The part of him that had built structure and distance had resisted at first. This town had been a closed chapter. Coming back had been temporary. Safe even because it had an end date. That had been the plan. Plans were simple like that. Life he'd learned was not. He glanced out over the park, the edges of a smile forming as he watched a kid chase after a dog that clearly had no intention of being caught. You know, he said, I used to think you couldn't go back. Candice tilted her head. Back to what? Anything, he said. Places, people, versions of your life. If you missed it, that was it. She studied him, listening in the way she always had, fully, without interruption. And now? She asked. Kyle exhaled slowly, one hand resting loosely against the railing. Now I think, you can't make up what you pass up, he said. You can't recreate it exactly. You don't get to pick up where you left off like nothing changed. Candice nodded once. Yeah. But, he continued, glancing at her, that doesn't mean you can't build something new from it. She held his gaze, something steady and warm settling behind her eyes. No, she agreed softly. It doesn't. A breeze stirred around them, lifting the edges of her hair slightly as she turned to fully face him. So this? She gestured lightly between them, her expression open but grounded. This isn't trying to fix what we lost. Kyle shook his head. No. What is it, then? He didn't hesitate. It's choosing what comes next. Candice's lips curved into a small smile. That's very mature of you, she said. I've had a lot of practice. Clearly. They fell into an easy silence after that, the kind that no longer needed to be filled or justified. It had taken time to get here. A lot of conversations, some difficult, some surprisingly light. A few arguments that had ended in laughter neither of them saw coming. But through it all, neither of them ran. That was the difference. Candice shifted closer, her arm brushing his as she leaned her hip lightly against the railing beside him. You know, she said, when you first showed up in that grocery store, I was ready to fight you. Kyle glanced at her. I got that impression. I had a whole speech prepared, she added. It was very dramatic. I'm still a little disappointed I never heard it. Oh no, she said, shaking her head. You lost the right to that performance. Tragic. It really is, she agreed solemnly. He smiled, shaking his head slightly. Candice leaned her head briefly against his shoulder before straightening again, her expression shifting into something more thoughtful. So, she said, no regrets. Kyle considered that carefully. There had been a time when the answer would have been complicated, layered with what-ifs and hindsight and all the things he couldn't change. Now? No, he said. She raised an eyebrow. None. Not the kind that matters, he clarified. That's a very Kyle answer. It's an honest one. Candice nodded slowly, accepting it without pushing further. And you? He asked. She thought about it. Really thought about it. Then, no, she said, mirroring his tone. Not anymore. Kyle's gaze softened slightly. Good. A group of kids ran past them then, laughter trailing behind them like something impossible to hold onto for too long. Candice watched them go, then looked back at Kyle. You know what I like about this? She said. What? That it doesn't feel rushed, she said. Or forced. We didn't try to jump back into anything. Kyle nodded. We took our time. We still are. That's the point. She smiled faintly, something content settling into her expression. I like the point. So do I. Another quiet moment passed. Then Candice nudged him lightly. You never answered one question, she said. Kyle raised an eyebrow. Which one? She tilted her head, a teasing glint in her eyes. Where's the weirdest place you've been? She asked. Kyle blinked, then laughed. You held onto that for 2 years? Of course I did, she said. I'm committed. He shook his head, still smiling. All right, he said. There was this town in Arizona. Candice leaned in slightly listening. And for Kyle Brennan, that was the moment it settled completely. Not just the decision, he'd made that long before he packed his things, before he moved back, before he told his dad he wasn't running anymore. No, this was the confirmation. He hadn't come back to reclaim something he lost. He'd come back to build something worth staying for. And standing there with Candice beside him, laughing, listening, pushing him forward without forcing him to be someone he wasn't. He knew, with a certainty that didn't need to be questioned. This was it. Not the past. Not what could have been. But what was. And what would be. Together.